well connected in the world of gene therapy in Italy. And Camilla is joining us from the MKO Group, our partners today. And Camilla is going to be talking about some of the learnings and experience with cell and gene therapy so far in the US. So I'm delighted that they're able to join us today. Before we actually get into some of the details, I just wanted to explain, if you look on the right-hand side of your screen, you should be able to see a Q&A button. Now, if you want to ask any questions throughout the session, please feel free to do so using the Q&A function on the right-hand side of the screen. And then if you do write a question, you'll see that there's an option to be able to send the questions to an individual or to all panelists. Please choose the all panelists option, and then we'll all be able to see the questions. We want to try to make this as interactive as possible. So we have these questions, which will be, we've got some time at the end of the session today to go through. And then we're also going to be doing polling questions throughout the session as well. And we're going to be talking about some of the responses to those polling questions. So please get ready to answer those as we actually go through the various different presentations today. Good. So let's start off with just a little bit about us, a little bit about Partners4Access and obviously our MKO partners. Partners4Access are specialists in orphan drug access. As a result of that, we get very involved in cell and gene therapies. And cell and gene therapies are very different and they require a different approach. And there are a few reasons for this. So first of all, looking at how to actually successfully demonstrate the value of a gene therapy. Now, you can actually think about this, and often we are dealing with very small patient numbers. And I'm thinking here of Strimvelis with ADA SCID is a great example where we're talking about potentially up to 1 in 1 million live births of people diagnosed with the ADA SCID mutation. And in fact, if you actually look at some of the negotiations that happened throughout the HTA process, then the company at the time, GSK at the time, were talking about really a maximum annually of 3 people diagnosed per year in some of the larger European countries. So it's obviously a challenge to be able to successfully demonstrate value with such small patient numbers. It's even more complicated when you talk about how to model that value over the long term. Some HTAs in Europe allow that approach, and I'm thinking specifically of NICE with a quality-based approach in England, which is very well suited to extrapolate uncertainties over the long term. If you look at Germany, for example, the GBA is not so flexible in its approach for modelling. If we look at the navigating the reimbursement and the procurement, certainly not just the reimbursement, but also the procurement can be a real challenge, finding where the money flows. And I would suggest that certainly the post-launch activity for Kymriah, for Yescarta, and also Luxturna in the US, probably the sales were not as high as anticipated because of some of the complexities involved in the infrastructure and also the payment complexity as well following the money. And then finally looking at the stakeholder concerns, and a few years ago, Gomiero broke that €1 million mold with its price point. And now we have Avexis talking about this Zolgensma therapy potentially up to $5 million. So when we're talking about these kind of price points, you can anticipate and imagine there are certain fears, not necessarily just within the payer remit, but from a broader public perspective as well, as to how to actually manage that budget. And not only that, but looking at the clinical impact as well from an efficacy and safety perspective, how does that play out over the long term? So all in all, there are really some complexities involved in cell and gene therapies, which is why they really need to have a specialist approach. And this really is why we're doing this third of our gene therapy webinar series. We started off at the end of 2017. We had some excellent speakers there giving an introduction to gene therapy. Last year, we talked specifically about some of the reimbursement challenges that were arising in the US. And then now today, we're going to be focusing on innovative access agreements. And could these potentially provide a useful future remit in the world of cell and gene therapy? focusing on that and wanting to understand why, really, let's look at some of the figures here. If we look at the number of companies that are actually involved in regenerative medicine, cell and gene therapies, it's significant globally. And how that translates into clinical trials, if we look at the number of clinical trials in development just in phase 2 and 3 that are registered in clinicaltrials.gov, now clearly that's not all of them, and not all of them are going to be successful, but we're talking about over 1,000 trials, so a significant number, and over half of those are actually involved in oncology. And it's no wonder then that certainly last week at the State of Address, the ARM, the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, really made a call for new payment models being essential for companies to have commercialization successes in the world of cell and gene therapy. So let's have a look at that and get into that in some more detail. So I mentioned just before we'll be asking poll questions, and we certainly will be. You'll see this slide come up several times throughout. And I'd like to start off with poll question number 1. So that is, and you have 30 seconds to answer this. You'll see on the right-hand side of your screen, you should be able to see some poll questions coming up in a moment. So the multiple choice I would like you to go through is how many innovative access agreements are currently in force throughout Europe. So you can see the options there, A, B, C, D, or E. So if you want to click on one of those, okay, and the time is already up for that. Good. So hopefully you were quick on the button there and managed to be able to respond. We'll be asking and we'll be talking about these poll questions at the end of the session when we actually go through not just necessarily the results here, but also specifically any questions that you want to pose throughout the session today. I did mention it at the start, but just for the benefit of people that have joined recently, if you do want to ask a question throughout, please go to the Q&A session. You can see that on the right-hand side of the screen. Ask a question, and then please do click send to all panelists so we're all able to see your questions, and we're talking about those at the end. Good. So let me start talking a little bit about access agreements in general, and then coming on to talk briefly about their use in England and Germany. Gianluigi is going to focus very specifically on Italy and the focus in Italy, and we're going to be doing that afterwards. I wanted to start by really setting the scene and talking about some of the models that are available for cell and gene therapies. So we'll see here on the left-hand side, you can see some of the payment models that are available. And I've split these into two types, those that are more finance-based and those that are outcomes-based. So let me just explain some of those for those of you that are not aware of all of them. Starting off with annuity-based models. So these are really typically looking at paying by installment. And a couple of companies, Bluebird and Avexis, very recently have been talking about and discussing how they would like to introduce payments over 4 to 5 years to allow payers to be able to finance their particular therapies. If we look at direct payment or distribution, Spark, classic example here last year, when they introduced Luxturna to payers in the US, what they were doing there is that they were selling the therapy directly to payers or to specialty pharmacies to avoid the provider markups, which was quite a unique way of actually going about it. Discounts, revenue caps, pretty obvious, and certainly, as we'll see in a moment, are used widely throughout Europe. And then if we come on to the outcomes-based models, or sometimes referred to as performance-based models or pay for performance, they can typically be split into payment by result or risk share. And in theory, these are really a great way to be able to measure value for cell and gene therapy. The challenge is that in practice, they are actually really quite difficult to do without having a solid infrastructure to track data in the real world. So they're used to a certain extent, but not as widely as they could be. Then if we look at the financing models, we will see this is really talking about who is paying for the therapy, what's the source of the funding. And if we look at the risk pools, if we look at actually reinsurance as well, both of them are relatively similar in that they aim to mitigate the risk of high-cost treatment by going through dedicated funds or certainly allocating premiums to dedicated funds for high-cost treatments. Supplier credit is really looking at lease-like financing, and patient assistance programs or subsidies are typically what we see already with orphan drugs in the US, where manufacturers support the part payment of therapies for patients. And at the end, you can see here the solely patient-based financing, where typically that's not necessarily the full amount paid by the patient themselves, but a mortgage over a certain period of time. And what you can see here, and the key message really, is that there's no right or wrong model to choose. There's no right or wrong way to actually go about determining the optimal payment or financing model for your therapy. It's really about typically understanding what's the best one for the therapy, what's the best one for the manufacturer, and of course, what is the best one for the stakeholders as well. So it's really trying to understand a win-win for all of the key parties involved. And if we actually come on to see now on the following slide, the number of models that have actually been used across Europe, so just focusing on 13 countries here, you can see the number of models that are actually utilised. It's quite broad. So we've got pay for performance relatively high, discounts and caps, you know, the more of the simple financial ways to manage the cost, the budget impact, the financial uncertainty of cell and gene therapies, that they are used predominantly at the moment in Europe. And then we've got annuity and direct payments are much smaller. Now, it'll be very interesting to see how that changes as we go through 2019, where we certainly expect an influx of new therapies. But you can see at the moment that the models that are used are fairly broad, and finance is preferred. And if we look just focusing on England and Germany, we can see that actually these are the two countries that have reviewed the most and have reimbursed the most cell and gene therapies at the moment, across Europe at least, not talking about any other geographic region, but just Europe. And let me just explain that. So in England, whilst the infrastructure does support the use of innovative access agreements, actually the authorities there much prefer simple discounts. So whether that's in the form of restricting the label, whether that's in the form of an actual flat discount, that is something that's preferred because it's much easier to manage. And it's quite interesting actually, because if you think about the infrastructure that is available in England to be able to track cell and gene therapies, if you look at the patient registries that are available, and absolutely the genome mapping project, where the government has already ambitions to map over 5 million genomes over the next 5 years, it's really quite a potentially sophisticated infrastructure, but still the financial easy, shall I say, the easy financial discounts are certainly preferred. And at the moment, the Cancer Drugs Fund is providing, or certainly for the CAR-T therapies that have come through, the Cancer Drug Fund is the one that's granted access to those therapies. Even then, we've seen label restrictions and discounts happening. We often get the question about Brexit. What does that actually mean for cell and gene therapy? I honestly don't know the answer to that, and I don't think anybody knows the answer to that at the moment as well. So it's sort of something that's looming on the horizon, but what the actual implication will be, I think, is anybody's guess right now. If we look at Germany, arguably the biggest commercial market within Europe for cell and gene therapies, the ability to track the outcomes is there, the ability of the registries certainly provides a feasible ground for performance-based agreements, for innovative agreements, but actually there is little appetite for that. We've certainly seen, to start off with, before the change in the AMNOG legislation last year, various different therapies were reimbursed without going through AMNOG. That now has changed, so the system is different. But certainly the the KKs, the sickness funds within Germany, are covering cell and gene therapies through their standard budgets. We are seeing some of the smaller sick funds, DAK is there as an example, starting to look to want to embrace innovative access schemes as a way to be able to manage the budget impact. Now, we started seeing that in the field of oncology, and certainly these are early days, but we do expect that to continue as well. So exciting times, certainly when it comes to Europe for cell and gene therapies, the use of innovative access agreements. As I say, there's no really one or a right or wrong answer, and perhaps Italy is probably the market with the biggest experience in England in Europe when it comes to innovative access agreements. And what we're going to do now is Gianluigi is going to explore that in some detail. So I'm going to move over to the next poll question, which you have to get your fingers on your buzzers here to be able to answer this relatively quickly. You should see some new opportunities to answer the question coming up on the right-hand side of your screen. Here we go. So we've got an A, B, or C answer. Just got a few seconds left to answer that.
Let's see.
Should see the answers coming up. Yep, okay, perfect. Good. Excellent. I'm going to pass over to you, Gianluigi. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sophie. And hello from Italy. I'm Gianluigi Casadei. I'm very glad to welcome all participants in this webinar. And I will try to show you some key lessons from Italy, mainly on outcome-based agreements. Next slide, please. I would like to start this short speech from Strimvelis, approved in Europe for severe combined immunodeficiency. This is expected to affect approximately 15 children per year in Europe. Strimvelis was developed in Italy and represents the first experience of evaluating the price reimbursement of gene therapy for the Italian National Authority. Strimvelis was awarded in 2016 the status of innovation, which is not a surprise, and after a very short negotiation was reimbursed the price of around 600,000 euros, which is about 680,000 US dollars, without any confidential discount, which may be a surprise because confidential discounts are widely imposed by the authority. The negotiation provided for a payment by results arrangement based on criteria you can read on the slide, and I think I would define them quite pragmatic. And the payment by result was set, the assessment was set after 12 months. No doubt this is a rather short period of time in relation to a therapy with longer term effects and duration, where at that time maybe are still unknown. Here you can somewhat appreciate how the uncertainty around those kind of outcome-based arrangements when applied to cell and gene therapy. 2 patients were treated in 2017, but no information is available. Next slide, please. So Camilla and Yescarta are expected to be the field test for identifying the most efficient and reliable approach to adopt for the price reimbursement negotiation of cell and gene therapies. Just to give you a figure, the overspending every year for hospital-based drugs is about 1.2 to 1.5 billion euros. I'm talking about overspending comparing to budget, so you may understand what is the value of assessing the budget impact of cell and gene therapy. There is a clear need of building up an experience, and Sophie has given very impressive figures about the number of treatments, cell-based treatment that we can expect in the next 5 years. And this is clear matter for concern. Both products, Kymriah and Yescarta, are currently under evaluation. We can somewhat be sure that the reimbursement will be restricted to a few highly qualified centers. Then it's not clear how the agency is willing to manage the reimbursement of those two products. I think, that's my opinion, the focal point is on how to select those patients for each of whom the expected benefit may justify a major impact on sustainability. Overall, just to give you some figures, so we expect to treat the potential number of patients to be treated with Kymriah and Yescarta are 80 children and around 700 adults. So I agree with what Sophie said, small numbers, but then this is the first step, and I'm just thinking what is going to happen for the treatment of hemophilia B, which is next to come. The debate is, of course, in progress, and in this slide I have indicated two possible tools. It's just a personal opinion. I would like to make this very clear. Outcome-based arrangements are likely to be applied, discussed, and the horizon could be extended up to 2-3 years. Then financial contracts. The Italian agency has gained significant experience with price volume agreements, mainly with immuno-oncology and HCV antiviral agents. Finally, we have annuity. I've just put an open question mark. That is the novelty everybody is waiting, linked to the reimbursement of cell and gene therapies. Next slide, please. Finally, I'm going to provide an answer to the question on the experience, Italian experience on performance-based management agreements, outcome-based arrangements. The Italian experience began in almost 11 years ago, and I would like just to draw your attention on a few figures. In 2017, we had 52 active outcome-based contracts. Most of them were payment by results. And finally, the agency disclosed data on savings on returns to the Italian National Health Service was 6.5% of a total payback, total return of almost $500 million in 2017. I believe everybody agrees this figure is not satisfactory, mainly when we take into account the administrative burden of managing those arrangements. Perhaps for this reason, the guidelines on drug governance published by the Minister of Health in last December indicate that these agreements should be no longer generalized for almost new pricey drugs, but should be limited to selected cases. And this is the space for some cell and gene therapies, for which is possible to establish objective parameters of efficacy. And I think the second need should make sense to assess them in the short to medium term, let's say no longer than 3 years, as based on the experience we got, it's difficult to track a patient for a longer period of time. The agreement on payment by result arrangement should be subject to the availability of mature consolidated data from ongoing clinical studies or follow-ups, and maybe also reliable estimates coming from stochastic models. In conclusion, in my opinion, price reimbursement of gene, cell, and gene therapies could be split into steps. A preliminary price reimbursement negotiation to be based on the data, the outcomes of registration clinical trials, then followed by a final agreement within 2-3 years. That's all for the moment. Thanks for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. That was a great overview, and we've had quite a few questions coming in, which we will get to discuss later. But before we do, let's move to the third and final presentation which we have today, which will be covering the US. Now, obviously, we've been really interested to see what's been happening in the US last year, and obviously will be this year too. Delighted to be able to have Camilla to provide some information on that for you. The poll question 3, which we have coming up, which is, which new payment model do you believe will be most feasible for cell and gene therapy in the US? So there should be questions coming. Should have 4 opportunities on the right-hand side of your screen. Some of them might be familiar to you, and some of them you might think, what on earth is that? So I'll be quite interested to see what the response is going to be. Oh, okay. So that's going to be interesting. That's going to be interesting to discuss afterwards. Okay, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sophie. Thank you for that introduction. As Sophie mentioned, we'll kind of dive into the U.S. perspective, what we've seen in the last year or so with 2 or 3 gene and cell therapies entering the market. But first, if we go to the next slide, please. I'd like to kind of take a step back and just start with some of the key challenges that manufacturers have faced to date in implementing innovative access agreements in the U.S., not just for gene and cell therapies, but overall. And we can break these down into policy hurdles, of course, data tracking hurdles, which I don't think are unique to the U.S. But lastly, probably most importantly, are some of the market dynamics in the U.S. system, which make it difficult for some of the more innovative access agreements to be implemented, specifically thinking about some of those new payment models. If we start from some of the policy challenges, I think what we hear of the most are complaints with the way that manufacturers have to provide, or the way that Medicaid best price is currently calculated, and then implications of those. So I think it's probably most currently in the U.S. Manufacturers are required to provide a mandated discount of about 30% to Medicaid, or if higher rebates are provided to payers or physicians that exceed that 30%, that manufacturers are required to provide that rebate to all Medicaid patients for all Medicaid units. So this has a very important implication, especially for cell and gene therapies that are targeting pediatric indications, where Medicaid becomes a very important payer. This is why when outcome-based agreements are currently negotiated in the U.S., you see that it's typically a partial rebate that is provided to a payer if certain outcomes are not met. And that rebate typically does not exceed that 30% because they do not want to trigger those best price implications for Medicaid. So that is an important consideration. I know that some of the agreements we talked about in Europe will provide a full rebate back if if certain outcomes are not met, and that's some of the discussions that have taken place for cell and gene therapies, but this Medicaid dynamic really makes that difficult. Revenue recognition is obviously something important, specifically for some of the smaller manufacturers that are commercializing these therapies. The ability to track data and communicate and share that data across organizations, again, I think it's also relevant in Europe, but in the U.S., having PBMs specifically take care of the pharmacy benefit, that makes it even more difficult for some of those large payers to track the medical data and be able to track those outcomes. And then lastly, as we mentioned, probably the most important factors here are the market dynamics. The U.S. is a very fragmented market. There's a lot of payers and many plans. So this is why innovative access agreements are typically not a pricing or even commercialization strategies for many manufacturers. It would require manufacturers to negotiate these very specific contract and complex contracts with many payers. And oftentimes we see some payers are open to these, many other payers are not open to these. In addition to that, if a manufacturer does negotiate access agreements or outcome-based agreements with a couple of payers, then there's an extra burden on the physician, which must track different outcomes, share different type of data with different payers. So it adds that extra layer of burden for physicians, and it can make it even more challenging. On top of that, you have a lot of patient movement. So you have patients that typically will switch plans every 2 to 3 years. And in Medicaid, the frequency is even higher with patients in and out of that system on an annual basis. So it makes it very difficult to track long-term outcomes. If a patient is on a plan 1 year, if the outcome is typically that you're measuring cannot exceed 1 year, because there's a possibility that that patient is on to the next payer, and they may not have the same type of access agreement in place. Despite all of these challenges, we've heard from the media that there's been more and more interest in these types of agreements, and we've even heard that there's been more and more of these types of agreements that have been negotiated. I'd like to caveat, though, that a lot of these agreements are typically with 1 or 2 plans. We hear of Harvard Pilgrim being one of the payers that's more in the forefront of this. ESI has started to negotiate some of these outcome-based agreements, but these represent a small number of all U.S. covered lives. Even when an agreement is negotiated, for example, with ESI, it could just be with 1 plan. So again, it's just a fraction of covered lives in the U.S. It's not widespread, and it's by no means a real commercialization strategy for new products to enter the market today. And if we go to the next slide, the approval of gene and cell therapies has really accelerated the interest in these types of agreements because of the unique concerns and characteristics of these products. There are concerns from payers, which we'll explore, that impact the market access of products, and in turn, this has created concerns for physicians that sometimes take on some of the financial burden and have to administer the product, which really has resulted on the impact on the utilization of these products. If we move to the next slide, we'll look into some of the key concerns for payers, but mainly we'll explore some of the impact on the market access that this has created. I won't go too in-depth into these concerns, as I think Sophie already mentioned some of these earlier in our discussion. There's obviously a lack of data to demonstrate the sustained efficacy. There's the concern that this is a one-time payment, and again, going back to the fragmented system, some payers are wondering, why should we pay for the full benefit of this drug when we only have this patient for 1 to 2 years? And then one of the additional concerns in the U.S. is the high administration cost. So when a drug is provided on the outpatient setting, typically payers will pay for the cost of the average selling price of the drug plus a flat percentage to cover the administration costs. But when we're speaking about, potential therapies that are $1 million, $2 million, that 6 to 10% administration fee can be extremely high for plans to pay, trying to understand, figure out a way where they can work through that. The impact that this has had on market access is viewed by some as an inadequate reimbursement to providers. On the CMS side, there's been a lot of discussion in terms of the DRG, how much should CMS reimburse for the drug when it is provided in the inpatient setting. And I think that the current policies are seen as not providing enough reimbursement to cover the provider's costs. And then, again, going back to the ASP percentage, some providers, again, feel that there's an inadequate reimbursement amount that's been negotiated. As a result of all of this, payers, and especially because so far there's been a very limited number of patients affected by these indications, payers are negotiating reimbursement rates with hospitals and providers on a case-by-case basis, which can sometimes take some time to do, and providers need these negotiations to take place before they administer the product, which has resulted in longer time to access these drugs for some patients. And looking forward, in some conditions, this could be unacceptable if patients really need access to that drug in 1 to 2 days. If we go to the next slide, this has created a lot of concerns for providers, which they did not necessarily face before. So if we look at some of their concerns, price density for some of these products and the cash flow concerns is very significant. So if we are talking about the need for hospitals or providers to purchase some of these drugs that could be anywhere from $300 to $1 million, and then be reimbursed for the drug 6 months later, sometimes even 8 months later or a year later, it's a real problem for some of these hospitals or providers, especially smaller clinics. Again, the uncertainty on the reimbursement amount requires the providers to really ensure that there has been a reimbursement negotiated prior to purchasing and administering the product. Lastly here is the handling and storage concerns. So again, because we're talking about a one-time drug with a very high cost, there are concerns of what happens if the vial does not, something happens with the vial, will I be able to recuperate the costs? And so those are real concerns that providers are struggling through. As a result, this could have significant impact on uptake of the product. So we see that there could be a decreased number of hospitals that are really willing to administer these therapies. Access can be concentrated in only few urban areas, and then as we've mentioned, there could be a delay in access, which could have some significant implications for some therapies. If we move to the next slide, we can see that with Kymriah, Yescarta, and Luxturna entering the market, there have been a lot of discussions in terms of how can we work with key stakeholders, both payers and providers, to provide access and be able to capture the value of the product. Some of these have worked, some of these are in process, and some of these have actually been starting to become successful. So we see with Kymriah, the first one on the list here is an agreement with CMS that would allow for an outcome-based agreement. Unfortunately, this was very exciting at the time that it was proposed. It was one of the first outcome-based agreements that CMS was willing to kind of entertain. but due to some of the political issues around that time, this proposal did not move forward. However, Camilla was able to negotiate some outcome-based agreements with mainly, we have heard, with providers rather than payers, which has been an interesting evolution. And then delayed payment terms to alleviate some of those cash flow concerns for providers. So I think there's been 60 to 90-day payment terms to allow providers to receive the reimbursement from the payer before having to pay the cost, and it really alleviates that cash flow burden. For Yescarta, we've heard a lot less noise, if you will, around these access agreements, but they have mentioned that they are open to value-based pricing on a payer-by-payer basis, but there have no significant announcements made there. Luxturna has been one of the more interesting products to follow because they have expressed a lot of interest in coming up with different solutions for both payers, CMS, and providers. There has been some discussions with CMS to avoid best price implications. We haven't heard this really move forward, and we haven't heard that they've been successful in doing this, but I believe some of those discussions are ongoing. The other big discussions with CMS is to spread payments over years, and this can be tied with outcome-based solutions. So I think, again, it's a the plan is payments over 5 years. If patients stop responding or do not respond, then those payments do not need to continue. This is something that, again, has not been finalized yet, but is something that it is in discussion, and it's interesting to see the CMS is becoming more and more interested in some of these discussions with manufacturers. As Sophie alluded to before, Luxturna has been able to negotiate different payment structures with payers to avoid those high administration costs. So the way this works is the specialty pharmacy takes the ownership of the product. They provide it to the physician, and they are reimbursed for the product by the payer, and then the payer negotiates an administration fee directly with the provider. This helps providers with the cash flow concerns, so they never have to purchase the product and then wait to be reimbursed for it. And it also helps alleviate some of the concerns for payers that would otherwise be expected to pay for 6 to 10% of the drug costs to providers. The other agreement that's on the table for Luxturna are outcome-based agreements measuring response and durability. So they're looking both at response at 30 and 90 days, but then also long-term durability of effect for the drug. So these are all interesting agreements that have started to take shape with the more innovative payment models still in the works. And I think that there's still a lot of work to be done here to get to a point where payers feel that these products are affordable and this is sustainable over time. If we go to the next slide. Where does that leave us today? As we mentioned, there are a lot of concerns from both the payers and the providers, but there's still a lot of barriers to implementing some of these access schemes, especially the more innovative ones. So we feel that it is very important for manufacturers of these products to start thinking about some of these issues and solutions early on. Some of these, of course, like the new payment models, such as payment over time, spreading out the payment over 3 to 5 years, would really require policy changes. It would require this fragmented system to really come together and allow for patients that may be on one plan 1 year, moving to the next plan the following year, to work together. Some of the ideas that have been thrown out there are patient passports, so that you can keep track of how many payments have been made. But again, multiple payers would have to come together and agree to the system. There's also been the Netflix model that's been thrown out there. I know that's the one that was mentioned in the survey, in the poll that a lot of you thought could be a potential solution here. And this really is the idea of a subscription model rather than paying per patient is plans, paying a monthly subscription, if you will, to the technology. But again, all of these payment models would require this fragmented system to come together a little bit more and put policies in place that would allow these more long-term outcomes and long-term payment models to be implemented. Manufacturers will also need to start thinking about how to support these patient registries, how to support the tracking of data. As we mentioned, it can become very burdensome for physicians. And as we've heard in other countries that have more experience with this, such as Italy, the burden of tracking this data and implementing outcome-based agreements can be significant. So we've heard, manufacturers thinking about ways to help support this and provide tools that make this easier for all stakeholders to implement. And then lastly here, we just, obviously urge early communication with CMS and some of the payers to figure out even how can clinical trials be structured to help implement some of these outcome-based agreements and also allow for different payment models to take place. And so that concludes the U.S. section. I'll turn it back over to Sophie.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. That was a fantastic overview. And I think what I'd like to do, we've had quite a few questions coming in throughout the sessions today. I think probably more questions than we're actually going to be able to answer in the time that we've got. But let's see how far we can get through. Before we get into the questions, one of the things I'd like to start off with, just talking about some of the polling results that have come through. And Camilla, maybe it's easier to start off with you in terms of the responses. What did you think when you saw the responses coming through with 46%, nearly half of the panel here expecting the Netflix model would be one of the new payment models in the US? Was that surprising or not?
In one aspect, it's surprising because, again, we've talked about how fragmented the U.S. system is and some of the key challenges in implementing some of these very innovative payment models. But on the other side, it's also it's one that's been thrown out there a lot in the media, and I believe it was the state of Massachusetts, which has looked into implementing something similar for HCD. So it's something that is already being thought of, and it was already thrown out there as a solution for some of the high-cost HCD therapies that have been approved. So it's almost encouraging to see that people are starting to think through these more innovative models and wanting to go into this direction. But I do think that there's a lot of work that needs to be put into this, a lot of policy changes and a lot of coming together of plans agreeing to these different type of payment models.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, previously, certainly manufacturers, especially in rare diseases, are very well connected, often with multiple stakeholders, whether that's patient groups, policy groups, obviously well connected with the physicians and the providers. But this is really taking things to a different level, isn't it? Looking at consolidation or potentially across manufacturers as well.
Exactly. And we have heard, as you mentioned earlier, we have heard a few manufacturers with products in the pipeline that have expressed similar interest in trying to put together payment over time models. And I think the more that manufacturers can work together to come up with solutions that they can propose to payers and CMS, the more likely we are to see some of these coming to life.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I had a question. Had a question on a similar theme to that. Let me just quickly get this through. So, one of the questions that came through was stage payments would certainly facilitate access to cell and gene therapies considering their current price point, but we're still talking about a relatively low number of indications. And then it talks about the fact, the question goes on and talks about whether it would actually be more challenging for smaller companies to be able to absorb staged payments than for bigger companies. Is that something that you, and please, Gianluigi, answer this question as well. Do you think that this stage payments is more relevant for the bigger companies, or actually is it also relevant for the smaller companies as well to be able to manage? And the reason I think this is an excellent question is obviously it looks as if it's one of the potential solutions here for some of the higher cost therapies, but also as well it really, for me, very nicely expresses some of the challenges involved, because this is sort of taking a healthcare manufacturer, not necessarily just from producing a drug, but also getting into the complexities that the manufacturer, that the manufacturing of a cell and gene therapy comprises, but then in addition, the financial stewardship that is actually involved in being able to manage this area. So do you think it's sort of more relevant for a big company, or could it also be manageable for a small company? What do you think? Stage payment.
It depends on the overall number of potential patients to be targeted. Based on the experience we had, what is needed is a strict cooperation between the national service and the company. I would say, thinking about the use of registries you mentioned before, the health authority, the Italian health authority, is deeply involved in their management, and so the discussion is whether on one side, the agency would like to manage those registries and all those agreements linked to the registries, because they feel they cannot rely on registries managed by companies such as I think is happening in the UK. So there is a clear administrative burden for both parts. That's the reason why I just outlined payment by results, outcome-based arrangement should be set only if it's easy to, it's feasible and reliable to set efficacy criterion and to assess them within a short period of time.
Right. Okay.
Otherwise, tracking patients is very difficult, as it has been already mentioned. Patients are moving. And then I think Camilla, they focused on the burden on physicians. So what you ask is physician spending 10 to 20 minutes to fill in a record in order to track the patient. And the physician is just demanding this to young colleague not really involved in the management of the patient. At the end, what is suffering is negative impact on the reliability of those data collected.
Right. Okay. Now that makes sense. Camilla, have you got any thoughts? If we just go back to the original question about the stage payments from a manufacturer perspective, do you think that is an easier model for a large company to take on board, or do you think it's also feasible for a smaller, perhaps a clinical stage biotech with a first gene therapy to consider?
Yeah, and I think we have to kind of also keep in mind the purpose of the staged payments. So if the purpose is to eliminate some of the risks, if payers want to see that patients are responding, maybe there are outcomes that can be measured in a shorter time frame that would make it more feasible from a financial perspective for smaller manufacturers to implement. If the purpose is to spread out payments just to make it more affordable for payers to afford really these therapies, then it becomes a little bit more challenging, I think, for some of these manufacturers, which may just have one product on the market. They may also be public, so there's a lot of pressure in realizing those projected or forecasted revenues. If you're spreading out payment over time and you only have one product and you only have 100 patients affected by the disease, then it becomes very difficult for a small manufacturer to really be able to offer something like that.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you make a really good point there in terms of the purpose. And number one is the purpose. Why are we doing this in the first place? Do we actually need to consider any innovative access agreement, and why? Understanding that before you're actually thinking about, well, what is then the most appropriate agreement to have? How many different ones do we have to have? And we've seen that, that we saw that in your presentation with Spark. There are many that they've got on the table because they're recognizing the challenges, and the purpose depends on the provider and the payer. So I think that sort of just being able to really understand what some of the complexities and the challenges are and the needs in this area are really, really important. So no, I think that's a great point to make. And then the second thing I'd probably add to that is, I don't necessarily know if it's better for a large company or easier for a large company to be able to do it, because typically what happens in a large established company is that those financial processes are pretty well established as well, and it's quite difficult often to be able to change those. So a pharmaceutical company that's used to annual revenues is going to be quite difficult to change that to a longer term model, and to be able to sort of manage the stakeholder, their shareholder concerns. So actually maybe in that instance it's probably better for a small company, more innovative and more flexible company that hasn't necessarily got all of the financial baggage that comes with it. Maybe it's easier for them to be more flexible in terms of agreements as well. But it's a very very, very interesting point. So let me just quickly ask. I wanted to go back to the poll question that we had. The poll question for number 2 for the Italian government question. So we asked that question, and it was, which type of access agreement do you think the Italian government got the best returns from? So we had 3 potential answers. We had A, outcome-based agreements, B, financial agreements, and C, don't know. Now, outcome-based agreements and financial agreements both got 42%, so there was a pretty even split between that. And then obviously when we came on to actually have a look at your presentation, Gianluigi, we saw a very different response. Are you quite surprised with the Are you quite surprised with that, with the audience response?
No, I'm not surprised, because that was somewhat reflecting what the Italian authority was hoping at the time they began to implement dozens of registries and outcome-based arrangements. What they said is, we are going to pay only for success. I think it's important to highlight the Italian payment by results are based on the non-success, which is, in other words, if a patient is a failure, the manufacturer has to pay back the full cost of the drug. According to a Latin perspective, non-success equals to success, which is not true in clinical practice, because, for instance, when we take into account cancer setting, stable disease is not efficacy parameters in clinical trials. Stable disease is classified as effective in clinical practice. So this kind of approach, the non-success, unfortunately is affected by a bias somewhat overestimating the response rate compared to what we know based on clinical trials. And then there are other reasons explaining why the result, the outcome was not so successful as expected. Just one more, the selection criteria and clearly the time to assessment. In most cases, time assessment is after 4 to 6 months, which is very short nowadays to assess whether a treatment is not effective, whether a treatment is a failure.
Okay. I'm going to have to stop you there because we're running out of time. I have about 16, 17 questions I haven't answered, haven't even got round to. I think what might be helpful is if we're going to put this up on our website, it'll be on the Partners4Access website, the MKO website, and then what we'll do, I think it might be interesting to do a Q&A session to be able to answer some of the questions that have come through that we haven't got round to answering. Thank you to all of the panelists. Fabulous job, Gianluigi and Camilla. Thank you very much for your excellent presentations. Thanks everybody for dialing in and also for your questions, and to Aparna for organising everything. So thank you very much and wish you a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.